Welcome to FYI, the For-Your Innovation podcast. This show offers an intellectual discussion on technologically enabled disruption, because investing in innovation starts with understanding it. To learn more, visit arc-invest.com.
ARK Invest is a registered investment advisor focused on investing in disruptive innovation. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. It does not constitute, either explicitly or implicitly, any provision of services or products by ARK. All statements made regarding companies or securities are strictly beliefs and points of view held by ARK or podcast guests, and are not endorsements or recommendations by ARK to buy, sell, or hold any security. Clients of ARK Investment Management may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
Bitcoin is a relatively new asset class, and the market for Bitcoin is subject to rapid changes and uncertainty. Bitcoin is largely unregulated, and Bitcoin investments may be more susceptible to fraud and manipulation than more regulated investments. Bitcoin is subject to unique and substantial risks, including significant price volatility, lack of liquidity, and theft. Bitcoin is subject to rapid price swings, including as a result of actions and statements by influencers and the media, changes in the supply and demand of Bitcoin, and other factors. There is no assurance that Bitcoin will maintain its value over the long term. ARK strongly encourages any investor considering an investment in Bitcoin or any other digital asset to consult with a financial professional before investing. All statements made regarding Bitcoin are strictly beliefs and points of view held by ARK and/or podcast guests, and are not recommendations by ARK to buy, sell, or hold Bitcoin. Historical results are not indications of future results.
I could not be more stoked for us to do our 16th Bitcoin Brainstorm. Again, special thanks to Lorenzo, Cathie, Lisa, David, Michael, Ben, and the entire ARK team for working with Bitcoin Park and myself on this. Cathie, you even just said open source. You love open source. Can you just expand on that just a little bit to get this conversation going?
Oh, what's so interesting about open source today is in the AI world, we're watching the open source models. If you look at performance of these large language models, and I know this is not Bitcoin, but I'll tell you why I'm fascinated by it. Their performance is improving at a faster rate than the closed models. So even though the closed models are still ahead of the open source models, DeepSeek in China dropped a bomb, which again, it's open source. The only notable one in the US is Meta's Llama 3. I don't think Llama 4 is out yet, but DeepSeek comes along. We thought open source was, going to die out, and here's DeepSeek, open source, and it has again stirred momentum in everybody's now moving faster than they otherwise would, and becoming very creative. There's a big question as to whether DeepSeek really was able to develop a large language model on a high-end workstation instead of using all that power in a data center. And we don't really know the answer to that, but open sourcing, and there are other open source models in China. Think about how weird that is. China, open source, like hard to understand. And on another brainstorm today that we have every Friday, I threw out that question, and the answer was, part of it is to destabilize the movement in the U.S., kind of catch us off guard and so forth. That would be their thinking. But from my point of view, open source suggests a lot more innovation and more momentum than otherwise would be the case.
Yeah. And I'm going to maybe bring Lorenzo into this as well than the other group. Is that why early on? Because I think you guys were still, again, the first folks on the institutional side that invested in Bitcoin in 2014, 2015. Was that one of the big reasons why that pulled you guys in?
The biggest reason was the conclusion after we wrote a white paper. And this was Chris Berniski. Many of you may know Chris Berniski, now at Placeholder. We wrote a white paper in collaboration with Art Laffer. And Art, when he read through it and understood what it was, he said, This is what I have been waiting for since the US closed the gold window in 1971. And I said, okay, Art, that sounds like a very big idea. How big could this be? And he said, well, how big is the US monetary base? Now, back then, we got in at somewhere in the $200 to $250 range. So it was around $6 billion in, we called it network value at the time, but to help financial people understand it, we call it market cap now. Now it's $2 trillion. And certainly has been a big idea, but we think it's still a very big idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the things that, we just actually hosted Cathie and Lorenzo last week or 2 weeks ago now, the Nashville Energy and Mining Summit. Actually, folks from Dr. Laffer's team were kind enough to be in attendance, and a number of other folks, about 150 investors, policymakers, mining service providers, and mining operators. One of the things that kept on coming up was this whole centralization that's happening in the Bitcoin mining industry, as well as we got a new sheriff in town. It's been about 30 days with the new Trump presidency. And we're talking about tariffs and different trade, new economic imbalances that are happening that have downstream and second and third order consequences. I mean, maybe I could pass it to Jose and Scott and Rob. Jose, formerly at Intel, how do you even feel about what's happening kind of on the global macro aspect here?
Yeah, thanks, Rod. Nice to be with all of you. The disruptions are real. It's a distraction a bit sometimes for people that care about the supply chain, right? So I think long term is a great move. But if you have to buy things from others, it creates a little hesitation. Think about toilet paper from Costco during the pandemic kind of thing, right? So, how much do you really need? I think there's a supply chain issue when you're a manufacturer of hardware that has long lead times. And that's just something that comes to my mind when we think about decentralization and tariffs and how fragile that all is. Yeah.
The tariffs are specifically on electronics from China, right?
That's my understanding.
That kind of speaks to a centralization that these things are all made in China and that you could just levy a tariff on a specific thing from a specific place and have an impact on this industry. I think that's one of the big problems here is that there is one specific place where it all comes from.
I mean, to extend this idea, Scott, I think you hit the nail on the head. And it's one of the things that really, it gets us into Bitcoin because Bitcoin as a bearer asset doesn't have the kind of counterparty risk that you might have with other assets. There's not this sort of carrying cost that is posing these huge external threat vectors. It's not like I have a gold vault that I have to build a Fort Knox around. But on the other side, we have something interesting that happens in the mining sector specifically where, because we're hashing SHA-256D, because we're proof of work, that necessitates us doing real work in the real world. And so that takes the form of large mining data centers, tiny data centers scattered across the world. And with each of those deployments, they have their own counterparty risks that they're not necessarily causing counterparty risk to the network per se because the system is anti-fragile, but they're very legitimate counterparty risks. When all of your chips are coming from one place, if too many people, God forbid, are using the same third-party provider and there's a security gap or another issue that pops up from that, we as the mining industry in particular, we're kind of where the rubber hits the road. And what I think is really interesting is that it's really us to now take the charge and start to figure out how a lot of this stuff applies in the real world because we're kind of the folks who are running directly into these risks.
Given the philosophy of the Bitcoin community and, how important decentralization is, I have been struck that we've been talking about this for a while. I remember we wrote a paper on Bitcoin mining. It was more from an investment point of view, but I was shocked at how much came out of China, and I am still shocked at how much comes out of China. It reminds me a little bit of, this sounds way off, but there is a link, of drones. I witnessed in Poland on an American-based training Ukrainians, all of the drones being used in warfare over there are DJIs. They pull the brains out and then they, use 3D printing and maybe generative AI. But it's like, why? Why? And the answer to that, and I'd love to get your thoughts here, the answer to that is in the Western world, we are looking at drones as simply a commoditized business, and there's going to be no profit in it. So no one's going for it. We would have to have a government mandate of sorts to encourage, or some incentive to encourage companies, certainly in the US, to produce these things. Is there something similar in the mining space?
I think she's teed you up, Scott and Jose. That was perfect.
Yeah, maybe it's worth doing a quick review of how chips are made and how do these things come. It's one of the most complex things that we make, right? As humans, it's harder to make one of these than I think get the person to the moon in some ways, depending on how you measure that. So it's complicated because it's designed in one place, manufactured in another, and then assembled in another, right? So now you have all these movements, and we talk about China, but our chips are actually coming from Korea or Taiwan and US and Europe in a smaller percentage. So in a way, China got the monopoly they have because Bitmain, we're not talking about China, we're talking about Bitmain, right? So if Bitmain was a US company based in Seattle, probably wouldn't be talking about it in the same way, but we are still dependent on the geopolitical happenings of, Taiwan being very, very close to China and being very controversial to say that they're different because, they have one China policy. So if you go back a little bit, we are victims and beneficiaries of the same problem that NVIDIA has and everybody else, right? Because these chips are made in a couple places. They're very expensive to make. And, we all have a couple friends here in our speed dial that could design one, but it takes $13 to $17 million to send the blueprint to the factory, and the factory will take 6 months. You have to prepay, and it's an expensive endeavor that takes at least 2 years. So no one that I have met in this industry so far, and I've been blessed to meet a couple hundred people, half of them talkers and scammers, but the other half really good entrepreneurs. And I think, thinking 2 years ahead is kind of tricky, but a lot of semiconductor companies have to. So I think if we look at the long game, and since you invited me, Rod, on Wednesday, I thought a little bit about this. So, we'll get into it later, but the decentralization comes from standards and some of the other good work that the foundation is supporting. So the traditional computer industry already figured this out. Laptops come from many manufacturers. They're made in an ecosystem, we call it, right, of suppliers. So there's no weak link in that chain. And because there's one person that doesn't make USB connectors, the whole PC industry doesn't break, right? So let's expand on that when we get to supply chain, but it's super interesting.
Yeah, Jose, it's great explanation. I mean, I was reading this morning that actually miners from Bitmain, Canon, and MicroBT got blocked at the border. Yeah, exactly. I think it's interesting because, obviously for the miners here in the US, that makes the cost of producing Bitcoin higher, right? And it's not something that you can pass on to the end user because they'll sell the Bitcoin and it's a commodity. It's not like people are going to pay more for that here, right? I think, the supply chain, I mean, we'll talk about it and you guys way more than about this, but it does seem now that there's a new sheriff in town, like AI, right? And it seems like for the supply chain, I mean, there's different bottlenecks, but the foundry, so TSMC, and then like the ASIC manufacturers, Bitmain, there's also energy and geography, right? So I think it's a very, very complex and kind of fascinating problem. I think, Jose, maybe you know this, it's not exactly the same chip as they use for, NVIDIA GPUs, but they all come from TSMC. My understanding is you have to order these things like a year in advance, right? And like really Apple and NVIDIA have, Apple, NVIDIA, like the big electronic manufacturers have, priority over this. And so the ASIC manufacturers they have to bid higher And so there's this whole dynamic now that is playing out. So yeah, I think it's very interesting.
That's right, Lorenzo. They come from the same place. They come from the same oven, right? And very, very expensive ones, and takes more than $1 billion, $1.5 million to make one of these factories. So when they start producing something, it's very important that they're ready to fill the factory, right? So these chips. So when I was at Intel, I'll tell you a little bit of that story. I kind of accidentally got into Bitcoin, right in 2019. I was managing our custom business, and custom things are things that are not in our roadmap already. So they're kind of like the weird projects. I was the weird projects guy. So at that point, there was AI projects were weird, and automotive things, and federal programs, right, are special and custom. But then we had some IP that we called it like a stupid little chip, right? Because it was very simple. SHA-256 is a very documented algorithm. It's on Wikipedia. It's about, we don't have to license it from anyone. It doesn't have a memory interface. It's not complicated like many other chips. So yeah, you're right. This chip is very, very simple. Does only one thing. That's what we call it an ASIC. So when I started to get used to this industry, people are calling ASICs the big box, and I say ASIC is a application specific integrated circuit. So it's like, okay, great. Let's not call it an ASIC. It's a system. But it was pretty primitive when I started to look at it. And by then, many people were doing many things. And it was controversial to bring it up at Intel because obviously, internet funny money, and we're a conservative company, and I don't work there anymore. I retired a couple of years ago to do decentralized AI startups. I'm doing something else, but it really benefits because Bitcoin showed us how decentralization works, proved it, and was the OG kind of of a blockchain being used for something that we value. So that was pretty exciting, got our attention. And then we had extra capacity. So why don't we make these chips? We can put 3,000 of them in a wafer. A wafer is that, that silicon wafer that you etch your circuits on. And it was very simple. So we ended up coming up with 4 patents on better circuit tricks to lower the voltage and how we could do this. And the people in the lab were very excited to publish these things. So we started to publish these papers, IEEE and so forth. And we got a lot of attention. So we started getting calls to productize it, and we realized we could productize it easily by putting some firmware and some software, putting it in a box, and we do our little business plan. And who are the competitors? Oh, it's mostly 90% from this one company in China that their 2 CEOs are fighting each other. We're like, okay, there seems to be an opportunity to be the good guys in this stuff, but I still got to know when we propose it. So I'm telling you that story because at that point, that little chip is, it's just hard to get it out there unless it takes a village. Yeah.
To extend that thought, Jose, and this is something that I think kind of ties into what Scott is doing, is that this is my kind of armchair quarterbacking thesis, and I'm curious for the macro perspective on this. Is that we have this market that has been so dominated by a couple of operators who it's almost like in an airport. If you own the slot for the runway, you'll do anything to not lose that runway slot. And it's like once you've got that fabrication, you've got that chip fab lineup, Bitmain is dumping in the hundreds of millions of dollars. WhatsMiner is dumping in the hundreds of millions of dollars. They're kind of keeping those runways, right? And my kind of thesis has been, and I don't know if this is naive, but not kind of knowing what the macro perspective is I look at projects like what Scott is doing with the Open Source Miners Union, and I think to myself, okay, well, you have 2 incumbents that really kind of own a lot of the large corporate production and the large corporate deployments. It's almost impossible to compete with them on price. So you see other operators come out and they try to compete on their firmware, their operating conditions, their cooling systems, something like this, but they're small. And then I look at the open source ecosystem and I go, these are like a bunch of aliens. The kind of stuff they're making, it's almost like this explosion of evolutionary growth where you have these bizarre 6-legged animals that are popping out. But I think, okay, well, that actually kind of gives life to the next decade's worth of mega companies. So from a macro perspective, and I'm curious to get the large scale thought on this, is that naive? Am I just kind of dreaming as I admire all these small open source projects? Are there analogs from history that we can kind of learn from where this kind of situation has taken place before?
I think we've seen it happen many times before. The ideas seem weird and obscure and like they don't have a market right up until they don't, and there's a massive market. And, kind of to what Jose said, that, it takes tens of millions of dollars to think about making an ASIC, the chip. that kind of limits the number of people that can get involved in it. But if you make the chips available to people who want to use it to build systems, all kinds of things can get built. We're just scratching the surface right now with what's being done with Bitaxe and the open source miners movement. But we know, and we've heard from many people in the community that there's all sorts of other applications of Bitcoin mining out there that aren't just these machines that, plug into the grid. And it's kind of crazy. Like we have two main manufacturers, maybe three. And for some reason, like their machines are almost identical. They look the same. They use the same amount of power. They have all the same attributes. They are targeting one market and only that. And we know there's all sorts of other things.
And another thing, Rob, is that nobody owns Bitcoin. Bitcoin is ours. All of us, right? Own it in a way. We can use the logo. We can mine. You don't need a special license from a company somewhere else, right? So the industrial mining and then recreational or open source or whatever mining, I don't know. I don't think that's a word, but anyway, it means that we're going to now leverage that power of open source. Like Cathie was saying at the beginning, this is happening on AI because there's a lot of money there, right? But the hash price, even though Bitcoin is at an all-time high, is still, not really super profitable to mine unless you're very good at what you do and you do it in large scale. So that's why, these projects like what Scott and the community are doing are so essential to the long life of Bitcoin, the stabilization of it, and the people are paying attention that have, I don't have hundreds of millions of dollars in Bitcoin, but if I did, I would make sure that it's not broken, right? And decentralization is the only key to make it safe and long-term.
What are some of the projects that we'd be surprised to learn of that are taking place because of open source?
Just a quick sort of analogy here. I think when computers first came out, like mainframes, these big room-sized machines that were made by IBM and companies would buy them and install them, I'm pretty sure they were mostly used for calculating payroll. Like that was what computers did. And these sort of new ideas like, I don't know, the internet or Riverside, and we might all be having a chat over the internet that was a weird idea. So I think we've yet to see even the very beginnings of what can be done with Bitcoin mining. But some examples that we know are possible in Bitcoin mining is one fantastic one is heat reuse. We at the Nashville Energy and Mining Summit, we heard from, they call themselves the Heat Punks, but led by Tyler and some other folks. They're reusing the heat to heat water, to heat the air, HVAC. And Bitcoin, a miner is a perfect heater. It's a 100% efficient heater. All the energy that goes into it comes out as heat. But the benefit to doing it with a Bitcoin miner is that it also generates Bitcoin. So it can subsidize your electricity bills, your heating bills, your energy costs. Troy Cross does a lot of interesting work and has talked a lot about using that fact to actually subsidize the build out of otherwise not immediately profitable systems. They do this in solar farms and solar installations. They can be incredibly expensive, and you can't even get started with this project unless you have a buyer for all that power that you're going to make. Some sort of way to some sort of path to profitability. And it can take a long time to get your project approved, and lining up those buyers can be difficult. And so here's this buyer, Bitcoin miners, that can come and co-locate at your site and are that sort of buyer of last resort. They can just swallow up any excess that you have. We've seen a lot of this co-locating with industrial generation projects to help subsidize them, and it makes perfect sense because they're so flexible. They can in theory at least move in and out as the demands are on this generation.
We did something called the B word. Rod, I don't know if
Oh, yeah.
the B word. Okay. It was It was I think it was 5 hours worth of seminars. One of the reasons we did it, it was in conjunction with Block. It was called Square at the time, but Block, was Elon had just put Bitcoin on his balance sheet, on Tesla's balance sheet. And oh my gosh, he was getting so much pushback for doing it from the environmental movement that is the reason he formed Tesla, right? To save humanity environmentally. And back then, we had come up with this idea of subsidizing overbuilding solar and wind because as intermittent energy sources, you could, when the storage units were full, you could use the excess to mine Bitcoin. And therefore, as you say, Scott, subsidize. This heat one is another one people were not thinking about at the time. It's just so interesting.
If you read from some of these people that I mentioned and others, there's so many interesting ideas, and there's people out there, the kind of mavericks that are trying to do it, but the current hardware industry and firmware, the whole mining industry is doing them no favors at all. It's an adversarial relationship actually between the people trying to utilize these machines for these atypical use cases.
Why?
And the manufacturers. I don't know. It's insane. But
I think because there's no standards, this was so clear on day one. I've been privy to helping with the USB standard, and stuff like that. And then you realize that people that make complicated electronics need to rely on each other as a community to leverage some of the basic knowledge on the things that are of less value, like cables and whatever, right? Also for interoperability and other benefits. The Bitcoin community is still, if I figure something out, I'm not going to tell anybody, and that's okay because we all we deserve our own IP. But there's a space where it's better for doing things so that it lifts all boats. And this industry has no standards on metrology. How do you measure joules per terahash? It's like my big pet peeve of all. We rely on marketing material from China to tell you that this is a 21 joule per terahash machine. And yes, and DeepSeek was done with $5 million in the back of a truck, right? So, taking things like that, it's a little bit, okay, but no problem. This is the world we live in. So what do? What we do is we buy 100 of them, put them in our fleet, and then measure ourselves. Because there was no reliable entity like a standards body to say that. So, imagine if before you had to test the Toyota Corolla for a month in your household before you knew if it was really going to be 39 miles per gallon, right? And you go to Consumer Reports or whatever. So things like that sound like low-hanging fruit, but also the form factors. That's another thing that everybody's just, mixing and matching things, because I bet you, I don't know this for a fact, but someone at Bitmain, when they come up with this, had a brother-in-law in Shenzhen that made cables or fans, and they used the 10-inch one, and that's what we all got now for no good reason. So that you would never have a PC industry or a proper data center infrastructure for traditional compute if we relied on these primitive approaches, right? So this is, 256 Foundation, an opportunity to lead the way, right? Because Bitcoin's not going to do it. Nobody else is going to do something like that unless we start.
So let me maybe jump in here because it's been alluded to a little bit. So Cathie and Lorenzo, I need another project like I need another hole in my head. But this was like really important. And the 256 Foundation was formed to basically dismantle the centralized Bitcoin mining empire. We keep going back to the Bitmains of the world, but it's in like a lot of areas, from firmware to just a bunch of different areas. And this actually, you mentioned Block as well, and I want to pass it to Scott, because at the National Energy and Mining Summit, and actually with Jose, they were very kind to make an announcement that they are donating 256,000 chips to the foundation for us to go and give to the community to build applications and businesses on top of this. We just mentioned a number of just small, from HVAC units in heat reuse to whatever else. But the chips, and actually I want Scott to maybe spend a minute to explain what the current process is just to get the chips out to make one Bitaxe, and how massive this can be. Because Scott was kind enough to do a fireside chat with Max over at Block for this announcement.
Right now, the Bitaxe, we use Bitmain chips. They're the most readily available ASIC, Bitcoin mining ASICs available. But this is not an authorized partnership. In fact, they don't sell the bare chips. So all the Bitaxes that are out there, maybe 25,000 or so in the last year, the chips are all unsoldered. They're removed from working machines. You can probably see the shells of some of them behind me. So the manufacturer, you're setting up a manufacturing line to build thousands of Bitaxes. You have to unsolder the chips from a working miner, which are now, as we just heard, getting harder to get. It's really not a good situation. It doesn't scale. It's not suitable for bigger players to get in. And it's in fact rate limiting the whole project right now. All manufacturers are just waiting on getting these chips because the demand for Bitaxe is huge. So this donation from Block of Intel chips that Jose is the father of, is huge for us because they're new chips. They come on a tray that's suitable for an assembly line process, and so we can really start to scale this up and get lots of these out there. And the cool thing about doing this with the 256 Foundation is that it's not just for Bitaxes. In fact, we're providing grants for people to build new miners, new use cases, whether that's home miners, heat reuse, stranded energy, or whatever they can come up with.
I told Rod jokingly he should have called it the 512 Foundation to double the donation and then bring the name back. But that's exploits in crypto. Always thinking. But I think Scott, and that was the hardware. What do you do for the software? Do you use the documentation in Chinese from the public domain that you reverse engineer?
There's no documentation. There's no documentation whatsoever. There's a whole industry actually that sprung up around Bitcoin mining, and it's the repair industry because these machines break down all the time. And they have a warranty, but it's really sketchy. Like you do not want to be counting on this warranty from what I've heard. So there's a whole repair industry. People will come to your site and fix these, but they don't have any documentation either. Like they don't know how these things are working. Like these people are just cobbling together hearsay and sort of field experience of what can possibly go wrong with these machines and how to fix them.
We were so excited, Scott.
I can't believe they work like this. It's madness. But talked to a lot of those people, did a lot of work myself to reverse engineer it, to figure out how they work. So it's basically just poking at it and hacking it, which is also no kind of way to develop electronics.
It really blows my mind, by the way, that you, Scott, you're a free and open source developer. You don't get paid any royalty. You don't get paid for any Bitaxe sales. You open source this entire project, and now you've spun up this small but growing and very enthusiastic group of home miners. So from Solo Satoshi to Pleb Source to a number of these other manufacturers that have built significant businesses based off of your open source designs. So when we're talking about like what are the cool applications, this is just like one scratching of the surface, in my opinion, of what can happen. The next one, and I forget it was Rob, you may have been, imagine like the HVAC person coming in installing a new, one of those $10,000, $20,000 units. And they say, how about you only pay me $1,000 for this $20,000 unit? And be like, well, what's the catch? Well, how about, it's going to have a Bitcoin miner. You don't even have to worry about that. And I'm going to take, 80% of the Bitcoin proceeds from it. And by the way, I'm now incentivized to come and repair your HVAC unit. Instead of having some subscription deal with you where I'm like, yep, it broke down again, I'll come to it, whenever. I now have an economic incentive to make sure through my dashboard to do preventative maintenance, actually to alert you about, hey, I'm actually going to come by tomorrow because I'm noticing some things that are a little bit off. Oh, but the heat works fine. Yeah, but there's a couple things I want to make sure. How cool is that?
That is so cool. But, and I'm thinking, just the way the world is going, as you know, we own a big, one of our largest holdings is Tesla, and there's over the air, they're monitoring, diagnosing, and over the air updates. So you don't even have to have a visit, or you don't have to take your car into the service station. Could that happen here?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, you're
that's exciting.
if you have a Bitcoin miner as your heater, it needs to be internet connected
Yeah.
in order to work. So it'll be internet connected. I mean, with great power comes great responsibility on that front, because we have people's privacy and ability to operate, need to be protected. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunities that come along there with predictive maintenance, predictive failure stuff. Pretty cool.
I was going to ask Scott, how much do you think you can scale this? I mean, it's really, really cool. And like, where do you see the most demand, like the type of application?
I've been focused on the Bitaxe, which is a small home miner, right? It's 15 to 20 watts, think like cell phone charger. That's kind of where the Bitaxe started. And it is for enthusiasts. It is not a profitable enterprise. When a lot of people think about Bitcoin mining, if they think about it, they think like, I'm going to be making money. I'm going to be making Bitcoin. That's not really the case with these. It's not, don't start a business with Bitaxes. Yet we see people who are very interested in it, people who just want to run it. It's very unobtrusive to run, and it's not very expensive. So you don't have to have a big upfront initial investment. I think there's a lot of room in that market, right? These are just enthusiasts, tinkerers,
Educators. I mean, I think it's one of the best educational tools to learn Bitcoin hands-on with a low buy-in and or cost for entry.
My goal is to get 1 million of these out there. That's an exahash of home miners. These are small home miners. We can obviously ramp that up to to bigger home miners, right? We can 10x the hash rate that's available, and that's still practical to run in a home. Any bigger than that, and you'll actually notice it on your electricity bill. You'll use so much power that you'd want to have some sort of benefit. And I think that's where we get into space heaters, HVAC, hot water heaters, and things like that, which is also a big market.
I do think, to extend this point, the question that you're bringing up, Lorenzo, is huge. And it's the question that everyone has been asking ever since the Heat Punk initiative kind of started. And I did some research and writing on it for the book. And I actually think there's a little shift that needs to happen in the Bitcoin mining Overton window before it starts to really, really kind of hit people in the face that, I guess I wasn't understanding Bitcoin mining fully. And what Scott's hitting on here is, how do you get quote unquote paid in Bitcoin mining? Well, you get paid by the network. Okay, well, that's kind of endogenous to the system. I get paid by the network. Well, how do I know how much I get paid? Well, it's commoditized. It's called hash price. Well, how do I optimize that business model? I have the lowest cost of operations, the lowest acquisition costs. I put together smart deals. I put together smart financing, and I put the cheapest electricity into it possible. Oh, well, great. Everybody's mastered that. A University of Chicago master's student is gonna whip my butt if I'm just out in a cornfield in Iowa trying to play this game. Now, reality, of course, is that that's not the case. But there's actually another way that Bitcoin miners get paid. And it's not endogenous to the network. It's exogenous. It's through the utility that they generate. So there's always going to be a place, and there's this huge place. Scott's Bitaxe project filled this immense hole when it comes to learning about Bitcoin mining, making it real in the home, being able to touch it, and bringing it to people at a price point and an operational ease that they could just run with. But then there are these other things around, okay, well, there's actual utility. There's really, really strong utility that radically changes this very simple business model of low inputs, really cheap CapEx, and then I kind of finance it out, and now I have a bunch of brilliant business majors running on it. And this is the brainworm that I think is missing for people, is that we kind of get the endogenous thing. But what we haven't quite grasped is the exogenous thing, this thing of, okay, well, if Bitmain didn't exist and all of a sudden we had these these chips that were ready and abundant and were open source and you could do anything with it. Well, now I have a tiny machine that produces heat and produces value. What can I bolt it to? What in the world can I go to and say, if I bolt these onto it, I can either use the utility of the heat coming from this thing, because heat is valuable, we like to be warm, or what if I bolt it to and say, oh, well, that's a bit of an atypical place to put it. There's been some wild things. Peter Todd, who's a developer in the space, has been a big advocate of this, which is this idea of, what if you just put ASICs on the back of solar panels? And you think, well, that's maybe a dumb idea. You go, no, wait a second. If you could actually do that and take a photovoltaic system, which is DC, direct current, well, chips like to eat DC. You put them up on a roof and you pop some fans under it. Now, all of a sudden, I have kind of obviated this need to build an ASIC farm that sits around my solar array. Now my solar array itself is basically deciding, oh, well, now we're going to consume the electricity, and now when the rate is appropriate, we're going to sell it back to the grid. So there are all these kinds of things that I think we're missing out on because we haven't quite grasped this. Oh, well, it's actually in the real world. There are these exogenous use cases that stand outside this kind of basic input cost hash price model.
You know what's interesting about this? Again, flashback, another one. As I remember GE growing up, I mean, under Jack Welch, really becoming a well-run company. And then, of course, they took all of this too far. But what you're calling exogenous actually was endogenous to GE. And they moved to a service model. And the service was, okay, yeah, the thing breaks down and I'll come and fix it, or we'll have someone come and fix it. That became, that one move took the valuation of GE up enormously because it was a recurring revenue model, right? Really interesting what you're talking about here.
I love that perspective too, because it's one of those things where, when you're kind of in the weeds, when you're in the forest of the Bitcoin ecosystem and you've been to enough conferences, you're kind of like, well, he has that idea and he has that idea. But I want to know the perspectives of people who have seen cycles, who have seen technologies rise, who have seen various business models. And that I think is where we'll know that we've really matured abundantly as an industry, is when we start to find where we fit in that broader ecosystem.
We keep talking about these chips, and we mentioned block before. Are we going to figure out a solution here out of curiosity in the US?
Block, you can see they're doing the right thing because they believe in Bitcoin as a fundamental concept. I had to spend half of my time marking it internally, right? It was really refreshing. It's already public information that when I had to shut down that business because Intel got into it during the crypto winter, and then we hit the Intel winter, right? So if you think about it, Block was always long on it, right? Block, Jack, and all the leadership there thinks is fundamental for the industry. And also they have applications that benefit from Bitcoin being safe, right? Because they're an on-ramp and off-ramp through Cash App or whatever, right? So in a way, it's a wonderful thing for them. We need more people like that and more decentralization so that we can all participate, right? Scott doesn't have I don't benefit from it anymore. Bitcoin has been good to me, so I'm trying to, do something back, and it's super fun for me to do this. But if you think about it, big companies that have to invest all these millions of dollars in making these chips have to be very careful of how they enable, how they spend their resources. They don't have unlimited resources of engineers to help people like Scott integrate these chips in the back of some, heater, right? They do the math on the market share for that, or this and then, and say, you know what, let's do them in just standard boxes, ship them to industrial miners, and we're kind of done here, because you're trying to move volume and keep the fab going. So there's a long tail of projects that are very difficult to support technically. And that's very expensive to do. You need applications engineers, collateral, reference designs, and you need to seed these units, and you need to answer the phone when it breaks. But projects like Scott's you can really unleash that.
Yeah, I would be happy with no support at all, as long as it's not like an adversarial relationship. That'd be great.
Well, that's why I liked that kind of Block's approach. And Scott, maybe you can elaborate on this. They did that big deal with Core announcing that, which was massive. And then we were like, okay, that's cool. But what about the open source community as well? I don't know if you want to maybe expand on that like kind of strategy.
Yeah, they announced a deal with Core Scientific for 15 exahash, which I'm assuming is about 15 million chips. It makes sense that they've had to invest a lot of money to get this far, and I'm sure they want to see some return on that. And they should, to keep it sustainable. It's a very, very expensive, time-consuming, resource-demanding business to be in. But they have also pledged to be open source or open to the extent that they can be, as open as they can be. And maybe I'm biased because this is what I look at all day long, but there have been a lot of people that are very excited about this. We can't have a chat on mining centralization without Block being brought up as the savior here. So I think there's a lot of people that are very interested in this happening, that realize this is the way things need to go. And I think it's great. I'm definitely looking forward to it. And I'm very excited to be working with them.
We're like running near the end of our time, and this has just been super awesome. I'm just curious to maybe some closing thoughts from this group. I'm mega bullish personally after hearing from each of you. I mean, getting guys like Jose that are, how many years were you at Intel, Jose?
25. But,
25. Think
long,
about this.
Too long.
No, not at all. You invested 25 years to become like this hardcore Bitcoiner for the next 25 years for the Bitcoin community. It's like this type of horsepower that every single day is coming and working in contributing into the Bitcoin ecosystem. This is why I'm so insanely bullish on Bitcoin, the monetary network, as well as Bitcoin, the reserve asset.
You want to go around the room, Rod, a little bit?
Please. Anyone jump in.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead, Rob. You wrote a book. I haven't. Go ahead.
Get out of here. Well, you've designed far more chips than I have, and have supported the Osmo crew, which is huge. I would say, what, one thing that's been interesting for me to learn is that I went through the same trajectory that I think a lot of us did, which is that you learn about Bitcoin and then you learn about mining, and then the first thing everybody says to you when you learn about mining is, "Don't do it. Nobody makes money." And you go, "Well, that can't be true, because it seems like there are a few big companies and they seem to have, pretty well paid staff." When I look at what I thought was a robust and mature corporate ecosystem, development ecosystem, technological ecosystem, and then I juxtapose it against all this amazing work that's happening in the open source community and happening at these smaller scales, I just become more and more convinced every single day that we have not even seen the beginning bleeding edge of the Cambrian explosion that is to come in mining. What we're experiencing now, we are like the protozoa, right? But I don't know if it happens 2 years from now. I don't know if it happens, 4 years from now. I hope it doesn't happen 4 years from now. I hope it's sooner. But I think that Cambrian explosion is going to hit, and I think it's going to be absolutely brilliant, the kind of technologies that we see and could not have imagined. And I think it's going to come out of the open source community.
We haven't even begun to see the amount of innovation that this unlocks, right? Like in mining right now, it's totally siloed in these small companies. If you want to play, you have to go work at Intel for 25 years or get a job at Bitmain somehow. I think once this opens up, it unlocks so much. And being open source it's not like working in open source is not this vow of poverty, like, oh, we're just doing this, for the good of it. It's quite the opposite. In fact, this launches businesses and industries. Absolutely. We've seen it time and time again, especially in technology. The fact that people can take this stuff and just start working on it tonight, whatever crazy idea they have, they can start testing it out, trying it, building, iterating on it, starting right now without having to ask anyone for permission, without having to get their idea shut down or whatever. They can just start building and going. And yeah, maybe a lot of those projects don't go anywhere, don't come out of the garage, but it doesn't take that many to actually come out of the garage to totally turn everything on its head and just ignite that sort of exponential growth in the technology.
Yeah, I'll pile on that to close is that the time is now for open source in Bitcoin, right? we haven't had this chance. My runway was cut short, right? Block picked it up and is championing that. So we have to be thankful. And then we can run with it further. The best is yet to come because we don't know what applications. When Lorenzo was asking, what sort of other vertical, is this going into? And it's like, actually, we don't know, right? To be honest, the heating is obvious because these things produce heat. So you just got to do something with the heat. Oh, maybe something beneficial, but there's a lot of things that can come out of that and innovation. So we know that, with standards, we can make that happen, because right now there's no good way to enable the next wave of people, because there's, we're guessing and kind of using other people's pieces. To do that, you have to agree on something. So there's a lot of room to improve there, and this is, we're at a good time to do that.
I mean, it was very interesting. Speechless. Like I it's really interesting to just see that there's open source movement in mining in general. I think. It's definitely one of the, big bottlenecks, I guess, for Bitcoin, the network, and decentralization in general. I also think, we haven't talked about regulation and BSR, the strategic reserve, but I think there's a lot of tailwinds. And so it definitely feels like, the next 2 or 3 years are going to be, a lot of exciting projects are going to come out of this.
I'll end by saying, Rod, I always learn something. I think that as an investor, I know a lot about Bitcoin. I didn't know anything about open source mining. And you saw how I responded in the beginning. I just didn't know this existed. And Lorenzo, as director of our digital asset strategy, I think we have a new white paper in the making here.
Let's go.
Yeah, let's go, because half of the solution is understanding the problem or the issue. And that's one thing that I'm proud of ARC's role, that, we give our research away for free because we really do want to educate people and accelerate these movements. So if we can get more people excited about open source mining, again, we wrote this paper 4 or 5 years ago, and I think we have an important addendum here, because we will be wrong by just from an investment point of view saying this is a commoditized industry. It's, there aren't going to be very many interesting investments in it. I think if what I heard today is the beginning of something big, and I think it is, I think we have a really creative white paper to write, Lorenzo.
So, Rob, congratulations joining Bitcoin Park, leading up our research and education. Now you got one more thing to add, supporting Lorenzo and team with whatever resources and so on, especially being the author of the Bitcoin Miners Almanac. We would love to help you guys on this and make this happen, because I think it's a great idea.
Yes, absolutely. It's so exciting.
Bitcoin loves white papers, so there you go.
Who loves white papers?
Bitcoin loves white papers, right? Bitcoin and white papers are good combinations. Great challenge.
Along with what we're doing at the 256 Foundation with Scott's lead and Eco's lead as well, there's 5 projects that we're really zeroed in on. Scott, you want to just maybe for 60 seconds explain the Ember one? Yeah.
This is the prototype. This is I'm missing one chip right there. This is a prototype of the Ember 1, which is, it's an increase in the power usage and the hash power. So this will be 100 watts. The last one was 15 to 20. This will be 100 watts. It's also modular, so you could stack several of these in a system. This might be useful if you want to design a space heater, or you kind of want to just up the hash rate in your house. But this is a fully open source project. This is funded by grants from the 256 Foundation and the foundation's contributors, but to design this. So you could build this and sell this, start a business selling these and the applications that it's used for, or you could change it up and if you have a different idea or you want to use different chips, the next version of this will have the Intel chips on it. So yeah, we're We got a lot of cool stuff happening here, and it still feels like the beginning.
Just for Lorenzo's paper for later, some of these things is people have trouble with open source, thinking, oh, it's free stuff, no money to be made there. But if we let people realize that the internet runs on Linux, right? It doesn't run on Windows, right?
Yes. So I was going to bring that up, and I thought, no, I don't want to throw this off, because I remember debating about Linux in the day when Red Hat came out in the late 90s. People said, this is crap, and don't even bother.
And it's a profitable company, right? So people make money.
Now it owns the data center.
And it created other industries, and the internet became kind of a thing, right? So I think Scott is onto something, and so this is a kind of a DeepSeek moment, but it's not visible yet because these are not in the media yet, right?
Just wait. Just you wait.
That's right.
You wait. It's going to happen fast.
All right. I can't wait to start talking about it in the media, and I will as soon as maybe when we write our white paper or whatever.
And then to close, what I envision is doing these white papers, then always having a brainstorm to anchor and then kind of explain the white paper with the contributors that are supporting the white paper.
Yes.
And then it's then you have this, and then that works as the prep. It works as the material post the brainstorm. And then we have this great in-depth discussion around that paper. Right. And then it's bang. And then you're going off on, CNBC, Bloomberg, and whatever. And it's just wow, this is
crazy woman.
Bitcoin wins bigly. No, the best woman. It's awesome. So again, thank you everybody so much. These are so awesome, and I cannot thank everybody enough.
ARK believes that the information presented is accurate and was obtained from sources that ARK believes to be reliable. However, ARK does not guarantee the accuracy or completeness of any information, and such information may be subject to change without notice from ARK. Historical results are not indications of future results. Certain of the statements contained in this podcast may be statements of future expectations and other forward-looking statements that are based on ARK's current views and assumptions and involve known and unknown risks and uncertainties that could cause actual results, performance, or events to differ materially from those expressed or implied in such statements.